Hello everyone, my name is Ray Konopka with Ray Software and welcome to this session in the Desktop First UX Summit 2021 edition. Today I'm going to be talking about how tab controls can ruin our desktop UX. Before we get into that, just a little background about myself. My name is Ray Konopka. I'm president and founder of Ray Software. I'm also a principal software engineer for the Walt Disney Attractions Technology Company. I've created a number of products over the years, written some books, lots of articles, presented at many conferences and sessions. I like to specialize in UI UX design, component development, and application architecture. I'm an Embarcadero Delphi MVP, and I am a diehard Chicago Cub fan. Although it has been quite the challenging year this summer. So, why are tab controls so popular? Well, there's three main reasons. First, they're extremely visually expressive. They convey what they do and what their purpose and intent is very concretely. So almost instantaneously, a user can see it and have an understanding of how it should work. They're also extremely spatially efficient, meaning that for really a kind of a small amount of screen real estate, we can group content together in a more logical way. We can isolate it more appropriately to convey information, to kind of guide our users to understand what we're trying to present to them and how to organize it. And so we have a really big bang for our buck with respect to the pixels we use up on the screen. But probably the most important reason why tabs are so popular is they are extremely easy to use. As I said before, because of the visual expressive nature of it, the way they look, their affordance is obvious, meaning how you interact with that control is really simple and straightforward because it takes some concept from the real world and blends it into the digital world. So when we see tabs, we understand that each of those tabs represents a different piece of content. And whether that's settings in a dialog box or different views of a particular document or multiple documents, all that comes through. So really what tab controls do is they help us manage content. And if we look historically of how tabs kind of came to their ubiquitous presence in our applications, we get a better understanding of what this really means. So tab controls manage our content by providing quick access to alternative views. This is probably the original use case for tabs. The most obvious example still prevalent today are spreadsheets. And so when you have different sheets in your spreadsheet document, you can use the tabs to switch between them. A number of IDEs will also implement this approach, and we'll take a look at lots of examples throughout this session. The next real strength of tab controls in managing content is by isolating related content. The classic example of this are Options Dialog boxes, and they've been around for many years now. And as we'll see, sometimes it works really well. Other times forcing that tab metaphor can actually be problematic, and that's really what this session is all about, is talking about, okay, tabs work well in this case, but if we go too far or we try to bend the rules a little bit, we can actually make life more challenging for our users. So we'll have a lot to talk about options dialogues in a bit, but the fundamental purpose of a tab control in that context is to isolate related content so our users don't have to look at everything at one time. We can kind of manage them into digestible pieces that what we're presenting makes sense to them. And then the final kind of area where tab controls really help manage content is by organizing documents. And this is the tab document model that is pretty much prevalent everywhere now. It replaces the old multiple document interface, which had its uses, but also was cumbersome to use at the same time. And so by utilizing tabs to organize our documents, it added a little bit of flexibility, so much so that it's really become prevalent. Now, that's not to say there aren't design challenges with them, but when we look at all the web browsers pretty much support the tab document model. Lots of integrated development environments do, certainly graphic design tools as well. And because of that nature, there's been some enhancements to the way tab controls work and how users interact with them to support that. And then where it gets really challenging is when we start using one style of tab functionality for another unintended purpose, and we can get some disconnects with our users. So really, we've all seen, we've all used, we've all interacted with tab controls, and they work quite well. However, there are challenges when it comes to UX design. One of the first and foremost is, how do we handle a large number of tabs? This is prevalent across the use case, whether it's separating views in our context, whether we have our options dialogues. We need to we have so many options in our applications. How do we manage that with tab controls? Is that really even the best choice, is the question we ultimately want to ask. And then when it comes to managing documents in our tab document model, well, what if we have a lot of documents open, which is quite common? And so there's a variety of ways that we can handle that. The management of context is also critically important when it comes to using tab controls. This is really prevalent in options dialog boxes and how we're conveying what is going on, what is the user interacting with, given a selected page of the tab control. So we'll have a lot to talk about some of those. Styling issues is another thing that has really started to become problematic, where designers, graphics designers, have gotten away from the obvious affordance of a tab control to make things a little bit more streamlined and a little bit more subtle, and we lose some of the affordance where it can actually cause disconnects to and uncertainty in the users interacting with the controls. And we'll have lots of examples for all of that. And then the last, I guess, general category of challenges is really talking about mixing of metaphors. Again, one of the strengths of the tab control is its affordance and its understanding that users clearly get how you interact with the control. However, given changes in style designing and things that have happened over the years, some situations have blended multiple metaphors into the tab structure, and it causes a disconnect. So we're going to go through lots of examples covering all of this. So let's talk about tab quantity. Like, how many tabs? Well, tabs by themselves, regardless of intent, work really well when your quantity is less than 10. Generally, probably around 7. If you think about how wide of a screen you have, the context you want, obviously the number of tabs and what is visible and interacting is dependent on the tab titles. So obviously shorter tab titles make more sense. Longer tab titles either get clipped or they take up a lot of extra real estate, so you're limited on the number of tabs that are visually available to be interacted with. One of the key cornerstones that I think we've slowly started to get to is the tab should occupy only one row and not the multi-line style that is still supported. They are very cumbersome to use and they're confusing because the way to implement them requires reordering and shifting around. However, there are still applications that do use that capability. So let's look at some examples. And so let me switch over. I don't know if I have that up and running. There we go. I'll go to my Scratchpad application here. And Scratchpad is a little editor written by Ray Software, yours truly. And one of the things that I wanted to look at before we talk about the view itself is the options dialog. And this is one of the kind of the bread and butter use cases for tab controls is to organize content into easily digestible chunks for the user to understand and manage. And so here we have an example where we've got one row of tabs. There's not an enormous number of options. It still works within a pretty reasonable set of, there's printing categories, there's key assignments, syntax highlighting, autocorrect, templates. All of these general features are all within, one little dialog. Easily digestible. When we look at this, you could kind of might be thinking, well, should I put the gutter and margin and the miscellaneous and the word wrapping and tab settings on its own tab? You could, but then we're going to add in 3 more tabs, which means we're going to have to make this dialog much wider, and we don't get much benefit for doing that because the amount of content that we're going to have with just one of these groups is really limited. When showing things that are related, which is all kind of text editing related features, yes, let's group those together. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that, and the next one I want to bring up is an application called Source Insight. And this is an application that analyzes your source code and does some interesting things with it. What I'm more interested in is strictly their options dialog, because it is actually showing a use case of a multi-line options dialog. And as you've seen this, maybe you haven't seen it in a while, but as you type through, the first set of tabs is reasonably okay. I'll have comments about the styling, that this is the Windows style, and I'll comment on this when we get to the styling section. But the piece I wanted to talk about is what happens when you click on this back row, I guess top row. It's not real clear, again, because of the styling. But if I click on this, everything shifts now. And so once you understand that, it's kind of effective in switching it around, but many users find that extremely cumbersome to navigate. And it'd be better, there's other alternate ways in order to manage that instead of using one row. Now, in this context, in a dialog for options, does it make sense to put this as a single row that you would scroll to the other things? No, obviously not. The benefit of the multi-line is to show all of the available tabs. The problem we lose is that the affordance of the tabs get lost because they move around, and that's not how real tabs work. The order should be implied. So what you'll find most option dialogues doing these days is to using another navigational page or vertical tabs, which you could also do, but unfortunately the Windows tab control doesn't support vertical tabs or tabs on the left and right, to where you could do a combination of both, because all of these captions aren't actually bad. You could make it a little bit wider, still use the affordance of the tabs, but you wouldn't have to have multiple lines. So we have lots of options to improve it without relying on, coming up with a completely different metaphor. So next up, we're still into the context of handling multiple tabs, large numbers of tabs, but I really want to focus on the tab document model, and how is this managed by various applications. Because unlike options, which are fixed in size, the application defines the set of options that are there. Now, there's either enough to manage in a set of tab controls and tabs, or there's too much and we need to come up with a different method to do that. However, with the tab document model, you're essentially unlimited in the number of tabs. It's how many documents you want to open. And I'm sure there are many of you out there that have your web browser up, and you're trying to research an issue or look up something, and you've got 15 tabs open in your web browser. And how do we manage that number of tabs to make it visually effective? There are, turns out, a variety of methods available, but unfortunately there's no clear consensus on how best to handle it. Maybe we'll get to some of that, but it kind of, each company is kind of on its own in how it develops that. So let's take a look at a variety of applications that handle, or how they handle multiple tabs. So first up, let's take a look at Chrome. So I have the Chrome web browser opened here, and I have a number of tabs opened up. And the interesting thing that we want to focus on is how do we manage, how do we navigate through switching between the various tabs and what we want. And one of the things that's very interesting in the most recent releases of all these browsers and what they've gotten into is they've avoided the scrolling functionality. So if I have more tabs than my Windows width, rather than have them be off view, the tabs remain visible. Now if you get to a point where there are so many tabs that you can't even have the minimum size, that they will offload into some other mechanism. But right now, using the icons can somehow times help. I've got a few from the Ray software site that are open. I have a number from Embarcadero's website, and I can move my mouse over and pull up a hint on each one, but navigating to the one I'm interested in can be quite a challenge if I'm trying to click through them. And so one of the ways in which Chrome manages multiple tabs is by having a button here to drop down and search for the tabs. And what I find fascinating about this is that we've switched to a vertical layout, which is great, so I can easily see it. But because each item in the layout is so big, and there's so much spacing around it with extra information about when I accessed it and so forth, I don't even have all of the tabs visible. I have to scroll to get to the rest of the tabs. The other thing that's quite odd about this is that there's no apparent order to this list. At first you might think it might be most recently used, and so it would move to the top. Well, no, not necessarily. The one you're on moves to the bottom. I believe that's because it thinks that that's the one you would not be interested in, and so switching it around, now this is, my Bitbucket account is back up to the top. So it's very odd. It's very hard to find what's here because they're not even listed in the order in which they appear in the tabs. So there's some heuristics that are involved. I actually find it quite frustrating trying to locate something quickly, but this is one method that's handling it. If we look at the Edge browser, which I have the exact same set of tabs set up inside of here. One of the things that's interesting is that they don't have a drop-down menu or pop-up to help me navigate through the tabs that I have on the screen. Instead, the latest version of Edge has introduced vertical tabs, where if you turn on vertical tabs, it gives you the tabs on the left side, which is actually quite interesting. What I find, they're calling it vertical tabs, but they actually don't make them look like tabs. And so that's kind of frustrating to me, to where it's like, okay, yes, I do know that when I've clicked on one of these pieces, because this is highlighted differently, that's the page I'm on, but it doesn't look like a tab. And so we're having to make connections between, oh yes, historically we've called each web page a tab, and now I'm going to have a new tab for that. So I have a little problem with that, but at least I can see all of the tabs that are in the list, and it's maintained in the original order in which is there. So it's somewhat better to find it, certainly not any faster. And then of course, if I've got a lot more tabs, then I'm off the screen and I have to scroll. That also is an issue. And then so I can change that back to turn off the vertical ones. Next up, I wanted to take a look at Safari. And so here's the Safari browser. Again, the same set of tabs. One thing's interesting, that, and this is on the Mac side, that Apple decided not to even show partial text once the tab gets to a minimum size and only use the icon to do it. So, which is okay, but it does eliminate some information. So I don't know what any of these are. And, finally, if I hover enough, it will take me to a preview of it. But again, kind of a bit of a challenge. One of the things that's interesting is I can't tell you how many times I've clicked on this, and this just shows me downloads, not actually the tabs. You have to click on this button, and what it does is it actually presents a preview of each of the web pages that you're looking at, which sounds great, except it's still clipping the text of the page that I'm interested in, so not necessarily great that way. And because they're big previews, I still have to scroll to get to the rest of my content. So, it's okay. Again, lots of ways to handle multiple tabs. Each one's kind of different and has its pros and cons. And so I can go back and we'll click that one. Gets me back to my view. Let me go back over to my Windows side, and I'll bring up the Scratchpad application I mentioned before, and I'll clear this up so we can see. And this has the same thing. It's a tab document model for files to edit. And the approach that it takes is it has a drop-down menu, but the menu is alphabetized with all of the tabs that are there. And because it's only one line per tab, you can actually get quite a large number of tabs that are visible. And it doesn't shrink the view down. Now they're off view and the scroll buttons are there, but the nice thing with this is that if I want to go to the standings, I can just click and find what file I'm looking for, and it will jump around and navigate. So again, different ways in which to present multiple tabs to your users. But be sure to pick something and be consistent across it if you are in that situation. All right, the next topic I want to talk about is managing context. Tabs are extremely effective when the content is moderately sized. If you have a lot of context, that's when things can be quite cumbersome. And this is where we run into the case of nested tabs. And nested tabs on its surface sound really nice. It's like, oh, I've got one group, and I've got another group of data that's inside of that group, and I can use that to manage and present different pieces of information. The problem that we get into is that we've lost the affordance of what the tab control does, because because tabs don't work like that. If we have a folder, we don't stick in our file cabinet, list of tabs. You're not necessarily putting other tabs inside of that and trying to manage that. So we get into some conflict of how is the data managed. But along with that, along with just the nested tabs and the organizational issues you have to watch out for, we also have to make sure that we keep the context to the user appropriately. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. So the first example we're going to take a look at is a program called ISOBuster. And it's an older version, but it really captures one of the challenges that I've seen in a lot of dialog boxes. And so let's pull up version 2X of ISOBuster, and we'll pull up just the file system settings, for example. And at first, when I first saw this, I thought this was a multi-row tab control. It kind of looked like it, but I couldn't understand. Again, it might be hard to pick up in the replay, but there's 3 active tabs, and then it became clear once I looked a little bit further that we actually have 3 nested tabs in the mix. And the outer tabs that are on the list here represent the menu item that they've picked. And so if we go to the communication, it goes right to the communication tab and goes back to the file systems. Of course, each of these other pieces have other data with subcategories, and I totally get why that developers would go into this route because it's a way of categorizing data. However, it's well, actually, this is my favorite one where they don't have any special settings yet, so let's have an empty tab. But what has come about, we don't see this as much anymore. We still do. There's still cases where it comes in. But again, this much data, there's too much of it. And so applications like, the Office applications and this, even ISOBuster 4.0 has gone with a tree structure to navigate through the various categories because visually it's clearer. There is a hierarchical nature of these settings, so let's present that, and it's actually much easier to navigate through that. Now, that's another talk, that's another section of having a tree structure drive your UI. You have to make sure there's an association between the node in the tree that's selected and the page you're editing. Too often, developers make the tree and it looks just like another option in this big options dialog. And so special care needs to be handled for that, but again, that's a different talk. So we want to avoid that. Another example where this comes into play is if we look at the T-chart component that's part of RAD Studio, and if we double click on it, we bring up the editor, and it looks like it's organized as a tree structure, and it is obviously to some extent, but as we drill down into it, there's more and more tabs that are inside of the various pieces, so much so that you can drill down quite a bit in there. And I think it's arguable to where, is the tree on the left giving us enough value? If we're having this type of structure that's between it, why am I switching between each of those? Now, you could argue that by switching the different axes, it kind of keeps the context there. If you were to change the bevel, and you could go for each of those, but you could still do that with it expanded as well. So this is one of those things to where an alternate approach would be, rather than use the exact same tab style that's in each one of these, is to actually do groups of them. Like, for example, the frame, the corners, the call out, the bevel. None of those pages are very big. Why not have the border settings all on 4 different groups on this page that represent the frame, the corners, call out, and bevel? Because I'd rather see all of those at once than this constant switching between the various tabs, because that's how they were grouped. So again, grouping kind of works well, but we want to take time to manage the content that without going down to the lowest possible level. Let's eliminate some of that and see if we can structure this a little bit easier to manage. All right, so the next up, we're going to talk about styling. And tabs are extremely effective when they look like tabs, when it's easy to distinguish the active tab from inactive tabs, when that active tab is clearly associated with the content that is intended to group together. It's when they don't. It's when the tabs have different styling or non-obvious styling or coloring that breaks the metaphor and thus causes users to stop and wonder, okay, is that a tab? Is that not a tab? Is that associated with this pane or that pane? It's also, we looked a little bit of it. We should be considering tab orientation where it makes sense. So let's take a look at some examples. So to start, we'll take a look at the Microsoft Word and their font options. So let me switch over to Word, bring that up, and we'll bring up the font options dialog. And one of the things that's interesting, and this is again because of Microsoft styling of the controls and making the tabs very boxy, having a very light window background, and having the content area of tabs be white. It's very easy for users to miss that there is an actual advanced tab on the fonts sitting in the back there. And so yes, it's kind of we've gotten to this, let's go real subtle with the tabs and have a look at what that looks like. So that's something to watch out for. And then we've gotten rid of the overlap concept in a lot of tabs these days. So the order is not necessarily implied, and we're using some other visual cue to determine which one is active. And so let's go to my other example is let's take a look at Excel. And if we look at how Excel handles sheets, we can see that it's actually quite obvious which sheet is active. They're using a highlighted bar, they're changing the color of the text, but they're bolding it as well. But it's quite different than the background. It's not as subtle as Word does it for its options dialog. Why? I don't know. It's the same company, but that's what they've done. But let's take another example. Let's take a look at, this is separating views with tabs, and typically that will be at the bottom of the page. So same document, but different views in that document, different context sections. Let's take a look at Rad Studio and how it manages the same piece. There's actually lots of tabs that are used inside of Rad Studio here. Unfortunately, aside from the editing tab, there's which shows you which one's active and which one's not. I can go and bring up another form, and we can see that we can switch between it. It's quite obvious which one's active. Again, however, we're really not necessarily associating it with all of this because we just have a bar that's above it. So there's an implied context to that. But if we look down at the bottom, this is actually a tab. Doesn't look like a tab. It just looks like a white box around code. Happens I can click on it. When I click on design, it's a little bit better because the white of the tab matches the white of this background, so it now does look like a tab sheet. But when you go to the code or the history, you lose that context. Because we also have no structure to the tabs and we're just highlighting it with a white background, I can't tell you how many times I have thought that these tabs here were connected to what's below it. So I've got like an area here, but no, they're actually tied to what's above. And it's only because I have 3 tabs here that I know that, oh, the white one is the active one, even though Data Explorer and multiple device previews actually look like they're connected to this page up top. So again, because of we're trying to make things a little bit smoother and get rid of lines and so forth, we've eliminated some of the affordances that tab controls give us. So next up, I'm going to take a look at Microsoft News. Let me go ahead and minimize this down, minimize Excel and Word. We'll get back all to those. So Microsoft News is kind of interesting because this is their, kind of a web-based desktop app that they've created. Gives you all this news access. It's great. And then you have this bar at the top that kind of looks like a tab control, although styled not really the same because we just have a bar that's underneath it. But if I were to pick on, politics, okay, well that all shifted across, and I click on science, and oh, well there's the top stories. So based on what I've clicked, I'm actually shifting it over. And so not only do I not have the affordance of a tab control, which is what it's doing, I'm actually changing it up to switch it around so the user doesn't know what they're actually, where to find it. And so that's a little odd to me personally of how they're making that work. It does kind of look fancy and slick at the expense of the user losing their place between the two. And going back to what they were interested in. Why not just click on politics and have the underline be there? And if I wanted to go back to top stories or the other values, I can easily do that. So that's another, again, styling deficiency in the tabs. So next up, let's take a look at OneNote, because OneNote is like it used tabs like crazy back in the day. And it still works. If we go to just OneNote, and I had this from the Office applications, and there's a OneNote for Windows 10, which I'll show you in a bit. But this is how they used to define OneNote, and it's when they moved it to the mobile platform that they ended up having to change it a bit because it was harder to navigate. So I get that. But there's some interesting things about this. Is we have this kind of old Outlook bar, collapsible nodes. But if we look at the tabs, there are colored tabs, which is how you would set up, inside of a notebook. You'd have tabs for your various sections, and then inside of there you could have various pages that you would have. And this is quite effective. It does look like tabs vertical, so I get a lot of data here, full titles, and if I shorten it up, it clips them as appropriately, but it's quite nice. One of the things that's kind of odd though is because I have more space, more tabs, in more sections in this notebook, the drop down is quite odd because it's showing me like exhibiting, speaker, future, vendor sessions is there, but tutorials is not, and regular sessions active is there. So it kind of skipped two of them and it decided to pick vendor sessions. So it's looking to see what would fit in there, I think. It's just a little weird way in which it managed that. But the vertical tabs on the sides, actually pretty darn effective inside of this one section. If we take a look at OneNote for Windows 10, and take a look at what it does, this was redesigned to get rid of those top section tabs where they actually made them vertical as well, and inside of that you still have the vertical tabs that you can scroll with. They made it a little bit bigger, but they got rid of the affordance that ties it to that page, which I wish they would have kept, because they could have. Like this could have actually had a white bar that highlighted it and showed me, in addition to the title with that I'm actually using that page, and blend that in. Here we have the affordance of like, oh, the vertical tab indicator for the section color kind of helps. So again, styling goes a long way to convey how we use a particular control. So next up, I want to take a few minutes and talk about mixing metaphors and what happens with when we try to combine, do different things, and have the tab control do both. And that's where we run into problems. And so I have two examples to show about that. So my two examples involve the ribbon. And the ribbon's a very effective tool, but it's a modified version of the tab styling. And so let's take a look at two examples here. We'll start with Wordpad. And Wordpad's interesting because it's using the ribbon, but because of the styling that they used, it's easy to understand why users would think File is the active tab and not Home, because the Home and View color is so close to one another. But it actually is Home is the active tab and View is the tab. And when I hit File, I actually don't switch tabs. I get a pop-up. And so I've disconnected. I've used a pop-up structure metaphor with the tab control, and you cause disconnects. Interestingly, if I go and take a look at Microsoft Word, Word does the same thing, but they've kind of gotten rid of the tab look of the ribbon sections. So I'm not calling them tabs now, but there are sections for that, but they're tabs. We all know they're tabs. That's what they were originally. But again, to smooth out the styling, they've just kind of made these things subtle, and you can just tell which one's active by the underline, which, again, okay, makes sense. I can switch between my tabs. But if I go and click File, I get a completely new window, overtakes the entire UI, and I don't care who you are. Even once you realize that's what happens, it's a disconnect from that. I think there's a better way that which they could have done that same thing if that's what they want to accomplish. It should not have been that, because that just is so disconcerting to what's there, and it's not obvious on where to find anything over in there, because this file now does so much stuff and not just files anymore, which is part of the problem. So that's one of the things we have to watch out when we do this mixed metaphor. So some other considerations when we're talking about tab controls is tab navigation. This was really common on a variety of websites, basically to use tabs on web pages to facilitate the various sections on the website to go to, and I've seen that translated to desktop applications as well. Fortunately, both of those are kind of losing favor because, again, they're harder to manage. It's not obvious that why to do that. There's other ways to section off navigation pieces. However, where tab controls, the controls themselves are really effective is in implementing wizards. Because you can have confined content, you want to go to the next step and the next step, but you have to remember to hide the tabs when you do that. I've seen wizard examples where step 1 says capture the address, step 2 says pick your shipping methods, step 3 says calculate total price, and then it submits the order. But a tab allows you to navigate independently. It doesn't imply any order, and so that's something to be concerned with. Another consideration with using tabs is if you're presenting content that makes sense to compare, then using tabs to group that can be quite the challenge, because it forces the user to switch back and forth between the tabs, and you can't see them both at the same time. So keep that in mind when deciding whether a tabbed interface is most appropriate. So some design guidelines that you can consider for using tabs is, arrange tabs in the order that's appropriate for the users. Keep that in mind. Don't put the least used pieces in the first tab. Have it most important to least important. Try to use 1 or 2 words at most for your titles. Easily digestible nuggets of groupings. That's what makes them really effective. If you have 4 or 5, half a sentence describing the tab, then you're missing the subtlety or the quick access that tabs give you. Don't use all caps for your tabs. You use title capitalization. Again, we're only using a couple words anyway. As before, don't use multiple line tabs. Avoid using nested tabs. Just to make it easier for our users to navigate between those. Be sure to ensure that the active tab stands out from inactive tabs. There's a real benefit to doing that. And also be sure to check out different orientations, have some fun with them, try some different layouts that you can incorporate to make them more effective. So real quick, I'm going to wrap this session up with a quick demo of the RZ page control and tab control that are part of the Canopka signature controls that are available in RAD Studio. So let's take a quick look at what those components give us. Okay, so here I have RAD Studio 10.4 open, and I'm going to drop a TRZ page control down. The tab control is exactly the same, except it doesn't have separate content pieces inside of it. But once we go ahead and drop this down and we click New Page, we can immediately see that the style that's used presents a difference between the active tab and the inactive tabs, using the different styles that's there. There's actually a number of built-in styles. You can go with backslash, that was quite common for a while, double slant if you want to go kind of that older looking feature there. Cut corners, quite modern, and you can control various pieces of each of these. One of the things that's quite nice, and whether you have round corners or square, is all built into the component. What's quite neat is if we go back, say, to the cut corner and change the orientation, we can put those tabs on the bottom. Obviously we can go and put them on the left, for example, and the left puts them, it rotates the text. If we want to do that, we can go in and change a variety of features for that using the various properties that are in the component. And so if we go down to, text orientation, it's vertical. We can make that horizontal. We can set the sequence to be the top. We can put that over on the orientation, and we'll put that over on the right side. Switch those up, make that horizontal. So if you wanted to implement vertical tabs in your control, it's quite easy to do that. And so if we would change that to the tab corners, and you can make those pieces in there. If you want to take a look at more of the features that are inside of the component, you can run the demo program that comes with it. It actually is a quick way to show the various settings that are there. Like, it has built-in support for the close button on each tab that's active, has support for the drop-down menu just implicitly built in. You don't have to do anything other than set the show drop menu component property to be true, and you can navigate with that. Tabs can be disabled individually. You can also color your tabs. So if you wanted to do coloring, that's built into the component, along with various, you can support images on each of the tabs. So a whole variety of different ways in order to get the effect, the tab control appearance and usability that you're looking for in your applications. And of course, it does pick up VCL styles, so it'll pick up the coloring that's active for the current style, and make that, use that same style for each of the tabs that's there. So that's all the information I have today. I hope you found this very informative and useful information, some extra guidelines, things to watch out for when we're working with tabs, because we do it all of the time. It's quite common. They're very easy to use, but we want to watch out that we make life for our users easy, and we don't make it more complicated because we decided to be a little fancy, or we decided to not spend the extra effort to create the hierarchical structure we need for our data, and we just start dropping things into multiple tab controls. So keep all those things in mind. I will be joining for the questions and answers. And if you have any follow-up questions after this, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm always happy to help where I can. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the Desktop First UX Summit. Thank you.